Hi, and welcome to the 43rd episode of Basha's Thoughts. Today I felt inspired to talk about the underlying workings of the universe, the underlying order, the underlying patterns, you could say. Because if there is such a thing as an underlying pattern that moves and operates through everything, well, then if we understood it, maybe we could use it, but not only use it in physics, say, to predict things, but also use it in the way in which we create systems like societies, the way in which we interact with each other, because it should be easier and better for us. Because that way we would not be working against the universe in some sense. Instead, we would be using the patterns that are already there, but we would be using them to everyone's advantage. So, what is this underlying order of the universe? That's a good question. I call it the holographic order. There have been people who have been looking for the order beyond, let's say, space-time. There are physicists working on this. And David Bohm was one of those who was interested in looking at something that he called the generative order. So the generative order is something that generates something new, something that is creative. It would be the order beyond space and time, so that you don't describe everything in space-time, and you would have space-time come out as a consequence of that deeper underlying structure or pattern, or in his case he called it an order, because it is that which orders. And it is interesting that he liked something generative to be there, because today in our basic theories of physics we have unitary transformations, and so that means that we don't really differentiate between the future and the past. There is no real direction to evolution. There is no expansiveness in one direction, and we would kind of like our basic understanding of how things work to be able to describe this idea of lemon juice spreading everywhere in your tea and not just being in one particular place. This is what we see in our universe, and yet we don't really describe it on a basic level. We do add it as additive laws, or we say these are fundamental laws, like the laws of thermodynamics, and yet they do not seem to pop up from the fundamental theories, like the quantum theory, for instance, or Newton's laws before, or Einstein's theories of relativity. So that would kind of be nice, and I like that David Bohm was interested in looking for that. So in physics, when we had the quantum theory come about, one of the things that were a challenge was ontology, and actually saying what it actually is, because in the quantum theory you have these apparently odd states of superposition where things appear to be in, let's say, for instance, in many different places at the same time. And so you ask, well, where is something? Is it here or there? Yes, it is here and there. And yet when you go and measure something, it's only here or only there. And so you start having these difficulties understanding or explaining what is. And this is why Niels Bohr recognized this underlying wholeness, and yet because of it turned to epistemology and stopped trying to explain what is. Instead, physics was taught as something, as particularly quantum theory was taught as a set of rules that you apply in order to get accurate predictions about things that happen, and it's not an ontological theory, then of course, after the Copenhagen interpretation of the quantum theory, you had many other types of interpretations and trying to bring ontology back and so on. So the question is, how can you look at everything? How can you start physics and try to find this underlying order so that you can then later even apply this to us and societies and how we interact so that it becomes a smooth way of interacting and working? Well, you would like it to be based on something that is fairly certain. So physics is based on materialism and the supposition of materialism, which basically states that let's suppose that there is this material world out there and it's independent of us, in a sense, us, or you could say awareness or consciousness. So whether I'm here or not, there is this energetic material type of universe out there objectively existing, and we can interact with it. And starting from that, we can build up. And it feels like this is fairly certain. We do experience this material universe around us. And yet, when we start thinking about it a little bit deeper, and actually when we start looking into actual physical experiments, we notice that maybe, you know what, this is not exactly certain. So you could imagine that, well, maybe everything that you experience is like a dream. Maybe you're like in a matrix where you're dreaming this world, creating this world, or maybe someone else is creating this world for you. And what you experience and think is solid matter is not actually out there solid matter. It's more like a computer simulation or something else. The possibilities seem endless. And you could say, well, it's not likely. I mean, it's very practical. And indeed, physics is very practical and useful as it is. But can we take it further? Can we move even further and try to look for that underlying generative order beyond space-time, so that space-time becomes a consequence? Can we find it? What could be more certain than the material supposition? Oh, and by the way, when I say that even physical experiments sometimes suggest that maybe there isn't really this underlying objective material world out there. I did an episode, I think maybe episode 3 or so, or 4, 3 or 4, that talks about these quantum experiments if you're interested in them. But how could we go about creating this, finding this underlying order? Well, actually, one of the things that we are fairly certain about is that we exist, right? We know that we are. Being is. You are. Now, you might be in a dream, so you might not know exactly where you are or what you are. So those things are not exactly certain, but you know that there's existence in some sense. There is actually being even more than existence, because to exist is to be outside of something, whereas to be is this innate feeling that you can feel, where you know that you are. This is perhaps the most fundamental and certain thing for us. And so, could we create our understanding and even base our physics upon this idea? Why not? This is an ontological type of approach because it's based on being, on what is. So let's do it. It has 3 fundamental steps to it. First one is the recognition that there is being, even though we might not be exactly sure about who this I who experiences it is quite yet. But there's definitely being. Now, the second recognition is that this being is actually unique. And this is the central recognition that leads to the underlying order of everything. Because being unique means that it is the only one. And how do we reach this conclusion that being is unique? Well, ontologically, if you want to have a real ontology and you're basing it on real being, this very real sense of being that you have, well, then you cannot base it on a washed out type of being. See, any ontology that is based around materialism eventually becomes washed out, because anything that is, if you say, well, this exists, the chair is, but then what is the chair? And you try to go deeper into its being, well, maybe you could say, well, its being, it's made out of wood, and so wood is its being existence. But what is this wood? And then you go deeper and deeper, and you try to find the fundamental substance. What is everything kind of made out of? What is it? And you go into it. What you find essentially is that you end up talking about limits and relations. A thing is its relations to other things. It is the limitations in some sense. And those limitations, those relations, are relations to other relations, which are relations to relations. And there's no substance, in a sense. There is no being. It becomes very washed out. So if you want to have a real, fundamental ontology with real being, then the only thing that real being can actually be based upon is the lack of these types of limitations. It is the infinite. But then the infinite becomes so infinite that it cannot be described, because any description is a limitation. So you cannot say it is that which has no limits, because that is a limit to it as well. And this is why we fall into these sometimes philosophical or even religious concepts of something not even being nameable, God not having a name. And that is being. So fundamental being is limitless, and it is unique. There is only one, you could say. And that means that our sense of being that we tap into, the most real and certain thing that we can be sure about, is the infinite, limitless being the unique being, and it is the same being for all. So this is the second part. The first part is that there is being. We know this. The second part is that being is unique. And the third recognition is that given that being is unique, it automatically imposes a self-similar type of order, a holographic type of order, because the being that is expressed in me is the same being that is expressed in you. Some people use the word of borrowing. My being is lent to me from the infinite. My apparently limited existence here is based on the infinite being. So I can here within this limited body experience only because my true essence is that unique being. And this is the holographic underlying self-similar type of order. Holographic because it is like a hologram in the sense that if you take a picture and you see a picture and you cut it up and you take a little piece, like a piece of a puzzle, then on that piece of puzzle you will have some information. Maybe you'll see a part of a tree. And there's no other piece of that puzzle that holds that particular information. When you put all the pieces together, you can see the full picture of it. And the information of the whole picture is held in all of the pieces, but separately. In a hologram, the information of each piece actually holds the information of the whole. So if you were to cut out a little piece of a hologram, you would actually be holding the information of all of the other pieces as well. So each part contains the whole, in a sense. This is what the uniqueness of being does to the universe, to us, because it is unique, the same being. And so the being that is expressed within me as a person is the same being that is at the basis of the entire universe. Whenever we move into infinities, we start seeing these self-similar types of order. It is natural for them to start showing up more and more. We see it with the real numbers. If you look at the interval between 0 and 1, and you ask how many real numbers are there between 0 and 1, and you have an infinity of them. You have 0.0005, 0.007, and so many that, of course, you cannot count. And then you ask, all right, so between 0 and 1 we have this infinity of numbers, but what about between 0 and 10? Now you'd think, well, what my intuition, my finite intuition tells me is that between 0 and 10 I have, 10 times as many as between 0 and 1. So if I have infinitely many between 0 and 1, I would have 10 times as many between 0 and 10. And yet, you don't. You have the same infinity. And so you see this self-similarity between this short interval and this larger interval. And actually, if you take the whole real line, all real numbers, and you ask how many, how large is that infinity? Well, it's just as large as the infinity between 0 and 1. So there is a self-similarity. these self-similarities become stronger and stronger as you take away the limitations, as you move into greater and greater infinities. And this is what we find as a possibility for our basic description of everything. Now you can start moving into mathematics and find mathematical descriptions of this holographic order. And based on that, you can then attempt to derive all of the physics we know now, space-time and everything, that dynamics that we have. And actually, by moving into the infinite infinities, beyond all infinities, beyond all limits, which isn't exactly possible because you will always have a description, but you can kind of try to describe something of the sort mathematically, because you can already describe infinities within mathematics and larger infinities and even larger ones. So you can use that, and that creates the freedom of a generative type of order to appear. Something new can actually appear. You can actually have an expansive direction in the dynamics, as opposed to having a unitary type of dynamics where there is no future and past. But how could we use this idea beyond just trying to derive a new physics? How can we use this in our interactions? How can we use this in our society? Well, we can model our society and how we act and interact based on this self-similarity, on the part containing the whole in some sense. Because this is what we see, a fractal type of nature. Things reappearing in different manners and yet within the same patterns. So you see the same pattern coming up but in different ways. This is why metaphors work so well in our world, because we're kind of talking about the same thing and yet it's different. And so we get a deeper understanding for something because of a metaphor. So we have different levels, but kind of the same types of patterns being expressed. So in society, we could use that. We could, for instance, move away from this idea of a machine that has different parts and having that as our model. So you have a part of a car that is the wheel, and the wheel doesn't know anything about the whole car, and it only works within a particular part. So instead of that, which is what we often have in our societies, the way they are built up and the way we interact, the way we learn, the way we teach, we are often taught to be these wheels. In school, we may be taught to become a particular part of society. And the idea is that there is a group, maybe a leading group, that organizes everyone and tells us what is important for us to learn and how we learn, that we should listen to this group that is an authority, and we should repeat that information, and we should follow it in different ways in our society, and we should work as a cog in the great machine. This can be useful and is, of course, in many ways, but perhaps it is even more efficient for us to learn to mirror the whole in every part. And so instead of having every person learn only about a very particular and limited thing, because we are being, we are this infinite, this is who we essentially are, we have access to it. So why not use it? And why not model it in our society so that each individual actually has access to everything and an understanding of everything? This, in a way, is a move away from a hierarchy where you have a group that is the leading group, and then you have others that perhaps execute tasks. And this is what we've had for a very long period of time, and this has been the only way to organize large societies, we have thought. And it has, of course, brought about a lot of problems in the world because, as we hear everywhere, power corrupts, and these power structures, hierarchical power structures, do not lead to the thriving of everyone, and we do have slaves in different ways in our societies. And the fear has been that, well, if you don't understand how everything works, then we won't be able to organize everything. And your mind isn't really capable of understanding everything. And so we have been moved by the ego, working through the ego, trying to do what's best for us. But of course, as we have moved away from evolution, natural evolution, into a technological ability to develop beyond evolution and impact in ways that are much stronger, we need to be able to have this bigger picture in order to make wise decisions. And so this is why when you have fear, well, then you want to have greater control, and you want to create these more totalitarian types of systems where a group strongly controls everyone else because everyone else is now so powerful that they could influence everything and make everything fall apart. And this is what we see in society today, a movement towards totalitarianism in different ways, and fear being very strongly propagated in order to control as well. And that fear is probably based around the fear of the ones in charge, that there is no other solution. But perhaps we could create a solution based on the holographic order, based on the way in which everything already works. How does that work? Well, that means going into our being, moving into who we truly are, into our essence. If you imagine the hologram being projected out into something that looks like a picture that has different separate parts, and yet if you move inwardly, inside, you see that every part actually contains the whole. So what we would like to learn is how to move in that direction. How can every part, how can we as apparently separate human beings learn to move into our essence so that we will have access to everything, and from there we will be able to create solutions that are all-win types of solutions, because we will be able to affect everything. This is the ultimate illumination. This is the illumined society, enlightened society, where everyone knows who they are and they act from there. But of course, we're not quite there yet. We identify with our bodies, we identify with our personalities, our characters, with so many things outside. And it is letting go of that we can start moving into the more holographic type of order, the more natural way of creating and being. And right now, our technology can actually help us. So what we can do now is we can create technology that assists us to move in that direction. And right now, we have this amazing opportunity of creating organization through autonomy as opposed to hierarchy. We can use machines to help us. There are so many different ways in which we can use our technology today to help us move in the direction of our essence, to help us organize as large societies in all-win manners, to help us move away from the structures that have not been really working well for us in the sense of making us all thrive, us as humans and the planet. So by actually spending more time as your essence, as that pure being, you are moving into a way of working with the laws of physics, you could say, moving into a way of working aligned with how the universe works, or the multiverse, or all that is. You are moving into creating or generating like the universe creates and generates, working within the holographic order and using the holographic order instead of trying to create pieces of a puzzle. You project the whole picture all at once. So by trying to move beyond current physics, by trying to understand what it could be based on, what is more certain than what physics is based on today, so that we can go even deeper, we suggested that we could go into our beingness and use ontology. And by recognizing that being is, and being is unique, we find the holographic type of order as the basic ordering principle for everything. And with that, we of course have access to it because we identify ourselves as the parts that are being expressed, but they are being expressed from the essence, which is who we are. And so understanding that on different levels and starting to use that structure in our daily way of being, in our way of interacting with others, in our way of creating and building structures, we are likely to be much more successful than if we attempt to create structures that somehow do not quite follow how the fundamental order of the universe works. And society is likely to be much more successful if it actually reflects that order. And so one part of that is having each part reflect the whole. And that's moving away from a hierarchical vision of power and using that as the means of organization. And we feel that. I mean, we all feel that we want to be free in some sense. We don't want to be slaves. We don't want to be a wheel. We are more than a wheel. We want to be able to be creative beings as well, even though we may enjoy serving in a particular capacity. We still are infinite being, and we project from it. And when we project from it, our service in a particular capacity will be aligned with everything else as well. And this will make things so much easier. So that was it for today, talking about the holographic type of order and how it's useful across everything because it is fundamental. Maybe I'll talk to you in another podcast. Take care.